Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the south where the Russians have managed to make a significant advance north of Novomikhailivka, where they've managed to capture the entirety of this road moving towards Pereskovivka from the east. At the same time, we saw some positional fighting in between where the Russians, through this, have managed to secure another supply route towards Pereskovivka. However, it is close to the Ukrainian positions further north. This means that the Russians need to push further and gain control over the additional road before it is clear from direct fire. And following that, they'll likely assault the Ukrainian positions along the final road between Konstantinivka and Marinka. The Russian positions here are closing in on Konstantinivka from the north, and we have seen consistent Russian advances in the south as well, showing the entirety of the front line are on the move here east of Konstantinivka and Vuhledar. Further north in the direction of Maximilianivka, the Russians have made a small advance and secured the southern parts as they push towards Maximilianivka. This shows that they have been able to consolidate their gains, are now slowly pushing onwards from the latest positions, which was the foothold within Maximilianivka. This also indicates that the northern part is being isolated from these positions. However, they still have supply lines to the north, which shows why they still hold on to these positions, as they have a river line in between their positions and the Russian positions, and to the east there's an open field which makes it difficult for the Russians to storm through it. So we see that the Russians are not prioritizing this despite it hurting their northern flank. They have somewhat secured their southern flank. They still have this large section that they need to gain control of, but we do see that positional fighting continues in the Pobieda direction as well, ahead of the Russian storming of this fortified position where they advance south of Ryorivka. So positional fighting continues on both flanks, and at the same time they're advancing in a western direction to secure their foothold. In the direction of Krasnoorivka, there's been several advances, one in the west, east, and northeast, as the Russians have advanced in all three of these directions. In the northeast, they are advancing towards the apartment complex and the hospital in the northeast. In the eastern parts, they managed to advance through some parts of the residential area, as they are pushing along to connect the two areas without storming the apartment complex area directly. It was reported that the Russians have gained a foothold within the apartment complex areas, so it could be a small push as they want to force the Ukrainians out. They can stay and fight or be surrounded at the same time, or they could withdraw ahead of time where they still have the ability to do so. And then in the western parts, residential fighting continues as well, and it is likely going to continue as Russians have pushed through the apartment complex area in the west, allowing them to push through the residential area where they will be advancing at a higher rate than prior to it. Now, someone was confused over my words of consolidating gains. What does that mean? It means that the Russians, as they are pushing through, they gain control over an area like the one in the gray. If they want to push onwards, then they need to secure this area. They need to make sure that there are no further Ukrainian positions there. They need to set up their own defensive positions within it to prevent any Ukrainian success in a counterattack or breaking through their positions. After that, after they have secured their positions, making sure there are no Ukrainian troops, and that they have set up defensive positions, then they have consolidated their gains, they are strengthening their gains so that they're able to continue onwards. Otherwise, they can just move on confidently throughout the entirety of the city, but because they haven't set up any defensive positions and they left some Ukrainian soldiers behind, they could face serious repercussions, and a Ukrainian counterattack could succeed pushing them back. So what the Russians are doing is that they are slowly pushing, but they're consolidating their gains every so often as they make these small advances. Like in the industrial area, they captured it and then they didn't move for many weeks because they had to make sure not a single Ukrainian soldier was left behind within the industrial area, and that took a long time. And then they also built up their troops in the industrial plants to continue these offensive operations to the north. Further north here in the direction of Avdiivka, the Russians have made an advance in Sokil and Novoalexandrivka. In the direction of Sokil, the Russians have now fully captured the village and only entered Yevhenivka and not Vushkhod. So with this, we see that the fighting continues in this section, and the Russians have now reached the road between Sokil and Novoslivka Persia. We see that the front line develops slowly, but it is advancing forward as Russians slowly capture village after village and advance portion after portion to improve their positions, consolidate their gains, and move on to the next target. The Russians are now moving in the direction of Yevhenivka and Vushkhod at the same time as they are expanding in a southern direction towards Novoslivka Persia. So we see a lot of fighting there. In the direction of Novodexandrivka, the Russians have expanded in the northern section, securing the forest lines, and with this they have consolidated their gains further in Novodexandrivka in the northern parts to allow a strong northern flank, and at the same time they're going to be fighting over the south to gain control of the fortified positions, strengthening their southern flank ahead of attacking Ustiveshenka, which is the final village ahead of the highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka in the north. So we're seeing positional fighting continues in the Avdiivka section of the front line, where we've seen constant advances by the Russians throughout the month of June and also in prior months. In the northern parts by Toretsk, we see a breakthrough of the Russians on Ukrainian positions, where they've managed to capture several fortified positions of the Ukrainians and reach into the southern outskirts of Pivnishne, where they are now reached the apartment complex area. And as I've mentioned previously, gaining control over the apartment complex area will significantly strengthen the Russian positions in the area, as it will allow them to consolidate their gains on the first line of defense and move on to the second line of defense. Gaining control over the apartment complex area oversees the entirety of the area, which allows the Russians to have the highest points ahead of the hills in the second line of defense. So this means that the Ukrainians will still have a significant advantage with the fortified positions and the hills under their control, but the Russian positions in the first line of defense would be unrivaled with their positions in the apartment complex area, and they would have secured them enough to launch attacks on the second line of defense. With this advance, there are several points. The first one is that there's this high ground position that is still under Ukrainian control / in the gray zone, where we see that the Ukrainians still hold control over Vivdene, which is here to the south and has several fortified positions of its own. There's also Selishny further south. This area was likely largely left scattered and not very heavily fortified, which allowed the Russian breakthrough through these positions, as the Ukrainians likely held their positions by the apartment complex area and concentrated there and in the central parts of Pivdene, the heights near it, and Selishne to secure their positions in the area. And instead the Russians focused on that to move directly towards the apartment complex area, and heavy fighting is taking place over it right now. If the Russians gain control of it, then they can practically ignore the Ukrainian positions in the south, as any counterattacks by them would be facing against the Russian positions in the apartment complex area and through the open fields, which leaves them vulnerable. Therefore, it seems the Russians went straight for the prize by launching this attack. If they manage to gain control over it quickly, then they will have secured their positions here in the east of Toretsk. These developments indicate that the Ukrainians do not have a significant defense. Despite their well-fortified positions, the Russians have been able to capture several of them and capture significant portions here to the east of Toretsk in such a short time, which indicates that the Ukrainians do not have a lot of troops in the area, because if we compare this to the Chesev Yar direction, then the Russians would already have crossed the canal and secured positions on the other side and started storming the city itself in such a short time. So we see that the Russian positions here are likely through Ukrainian fortified positions where they have not had time to properly resupply these areas, and this again shows the effectiveness of the Russian Kharkiv offensive. Despite their failure to gain any significant positions of the Ukrainians in the north, they've been able to divert as many soldiers as is needed to launch additional operations, such as the one here in Toretsk. At the same time, in the Chesev Yar direction, we also see significant developments here. Significant developments in the sense that the Russians have made a small advance here to the south of Kalinia, north of the micro district, and gaining a foothold within the forest area. But at the same time, we see this geolocated footage here, seeing and showing Russian positions across the canal line. What we see is Russian soldiers have managed to pass through the forest area and gain a foothold across the canal. However, I'm leaving it in the gray zone because last time we saw something like this, the Ukrainians counterattacked and recaptured the positions. So until the Russians have consolidated their gains in Kalinia and the Chesev Yar micro district, it is difficult for them to actually consolidate their gains and get a position ahead of the canal and gaining a foothold there. So until the Russians capture Kalinia and the micro-district, or if they have secured their positions by gaining control over the fortified positions and gaining this foothold across the canal properly, then it will remain as a gray zone. And that is all of the developments for today's update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.